Welcome to the Call to Flourish podcast. My name is Thomas Cronquist. I'm the co-host with Father Charles Sikorski, the president of Divine Mercy University. Father Charles, how are you today?
Very well, Tom. How are you?
Doing well. We have another very interesting talk with Dr. Julia Klausley, who is the director of the Master of Psychology program here at the university. She is doing work, research on depression among college students, and also the importance of spirituality in marriage. And today she's going to talk to us about the former. So Dr. Julia Klausley, welcome. How are you today?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, this is a very, very important topic, depression among college students. We hear that, especially today with the pandemic, that's on the rise. Can you talk to us about what you're seeing and what the challenges are?
Yeah. So, of course, pandemic has made things even worse. But even before the pandemic, one of the reasons I got interested in depression in college students is these just huge percentages of students who are struggling with clinical levels depression. So some of the newer research suggests like up to 33, 35-ish% of college students at some point would meet criteria for clinical depression, which of course is a huge, staggering number. And trying to think, well, especially those who are identifying as Christians, how would their faith help them in these times of stress and struggle?
Well, we have, there's obviously with COVID and the lockdowns, that's a big challenge. Also, you have things like, social media. I've read things where that can lead to depression when especially at a college age, you're not getting the number of likes you want on Facebook or one of these things, or, or you get criticized by someone else or something along those lines. Is there research relating to that as well as a potential cause?
Well, I think there is some good research on bullying over social media that happens, relational aggression that happens through texting, social exclusion, right? Group picture, everybody's on it, but I'm not. And then that gets posted. But I think maybe the effect of that is even more when the different universities who have had students come back in person, yet most of the classes now are online. So we have thousands and thousands of students sitting in their little dorm room, not even sharing a dorm room, no more roommates, right? You're supposed to be on your own. So all of a sudden, the effect of that social media piece probably even greater.
Yeah. I would imagine not having interaction with other individuals in person. There was a lot of conveniences for, I think, everybody. It was like a two-edged sword here when we're dealing with COVID. I think people like working from home. It has some advantages to not have to fight traffic, or maybe, you can get out of bed a little bit later and whatnot. At what point, is it something where we get cooped into the house, and it's just psychologically good, I think, to get outside of our homes and be with other people who are important to us in one way or another, whether they're companions in the university or work compatriots. So what advice can we give? Because now some of these lockdowns and rules of the schools prevent young people from leaving their dorm or leaving their home. Mm-hmm. Any advice for those folks?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, challenging situation. So what's interesting, one of our data collections we did over the last few years, we looked at role of social support, perception of social support, and which is really strong predictor of feeling less depressed if I have a perception of good social support. Now during the pandemic, that might be challenging to live that out, right? But it's also, I think, important to know that for the students to know themselves and for the screening, what we found, if somebody comes from an insecure attachment background, maybe difficult family background, comes from a background of not having had those secure, supportive relationship, that really affects the way they view their social support options. They might not see relationships as supportive. So now I could imagine, we don't have data on that yet, in the pandemic, that would be even worse, right? Because I'm not even around people anymore. If I already have that thought of, well, probably relationships are not going to help me as much, that never gets confirmed the other way because I'm around people. Maybe I'm not around people, gives me an excuse to withdraw even more because of COVID, and I'm supposed to be isolated anyway.
I noticed with my children during this pandemic that they're obviously spending a lot of time on computers, but they're communicating with people through the internet, relatives, cousins, but also people they don't know, playing games and things like that. And they refer to these people as their friends. And I sometimes think to myself, what kind of friendship can you develop virtually? What is there any kind of understanding about the difference between let's say a personal face-to-face relationship versus these virtual relationships, and what are the advantage or disadvantages of each? How do they compare, contrast?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I think there's a growing body of literature, and I mean the pandemic just started in March, so it'll be interesting in the next year or two, and what we learn about the effects on depression, on emotional well-being. What I was really interested in the research we did was, how does the role of faith and the walk with God play into this, right? There's a concept that's been kind of developed in the research literature over the last few years. It's called spiritual coping. And it really describes the ability to turn to God in times of stress. And do I have a walk of faith that helps me turn to God in times of stress? Or in difficult times, do I have that cognition of God is punishing me, or he's not there for me? And we found that piece is a huge link in how students deal with stressors, difficulties, and how are they able to cope with it, either positively or not so positive.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. What role does faith play when someone who's really, say, clinically depressed, from a psychological clinical standpoint, do we need kind of both? Obviously, faith is very important in helping us counter that, but also, do we also need therapy or counseling or just someone to talk to? And because there's some people, you might see two extremes out there. Someone who just says, well, that you just need to have faith and not be worried. St. Paul talks about putting our anxieties in God's hands. And that should, I'm not sure he means that to be a cure-all, right? And that's not that we don't have human relationships that help us. How would you say? Because the other extreme is to say, well, no, it's not really, it's just, I'm good in my faith, but it's really just a human issue here. Seems to me there needs to be a balance. And would you agree with that? Is there any kind of evidence or research that might support that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So obviously, somebody struggling with clinical levels of depression, very, very important to seek help, very important to be in treatment, to seek out counseling, somebody who is trained in working with somebody who struggles with depression. So I would say hugely important, right? And especially during the pandemic, in this isolation, even more so important to have kind of a mental health check-in to make sure we're okay, right? If we notice our thoughts going more and more in the negative, where the sad feelings kind of overtake most of the day, definitely warning signs to say, I need to reach out. What we were interested in is, and I think with that, just to follow up, somebody who is in that will probably perceive God as less supportive. Will have a hard time making use or having a positive role of faith because of the struggle with depression. So thank you for bringing that up. That's hugely important, that we are not on our own thinking, I will just pray and I'll be good, that we seek help.
Right, that's one of the things we try to do here at Divine Mercy University in our programs, right, is to bridge the gap between faith and science, or have the two talking together. St. John Paul II wrote about this in his advice to confessors, that the confessor needs to remember he's not a psychologist, and the psychologist needs to remember he's not the priest, or she's not the priest. And so one of the things we try to achieve in our work here is to build those relationships. And so it's kind of a both and a way of looking at all kinds of mental health issues, but especially something like depression, which tends to be very complex. What would your advice be to pastors out there who maybe oftentimes have people, parishioners or members of their church who come with problems, and they might think the person is depressed? Advice, what can they do? What shouldn't they do?
That's a good question, tough question. So I think if you have any inclination that the person is clinically depressed, you want to refer. Right? There are people out there who are trained. It's a long and thorough training. As we see at DMU, our counseling program, our Psy.D program, our students go through years of very good, thorough training to be effective in helping people who are struggling with clinical depression. I think in addition, there is a support question, right? Or maybe a preventative question, right? So once somebody is in that place of really being clinically depressed, so important to find professional help. But then there's a huge question about preventative work, right? Eliminating risk factors, finding things that are supportive, that maybe the students don't even end up in that place of clinical depression. And it's interesting thinking about faith and the relationship to well-being. One of the variables what we were interested in looking at was comes out of that whole literature of discrepancy theory. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's that idea of thinking I'm falling short, right? If I should be here, but I'm only here. Now that applies to academic work, right? Very prevalent among students. I should have A's, but I maybe had a B+. I should have all these friends. I should have all these Facebook friends, right? So discrepancy theory shows whenever a student or a person has that sense of falling short, not being where they should be or would want to be, it's pretty highly linked to depressive thoughts and feelings. So what we found is that can also apply to spirituality. Feeling like I'm feeling a little down, well, I should be fine because I'm a Christian. Well, I should just pray more and I'm sure I'm fine. And that thought pattern actually adds to depression. If somebody goes down that path, we found actually a pretty strong correlation to more depressive symptomology. So, and I think the pastor, the priest is coming alongside and reevaluating, right? How am I processing my faith? Am I having those supportive networks and interactions with people? Am I having this work sense of faith where I always feel like I should be better, further,
That's a great point. There's a saying out there, Christians aren't perfect, just forgiven.
Yeah.
And that kind of perfectionism in our spiritual life can actually be dangerous, right? When we feel like, I should be better. We're all going to fall short in one way or another, and we really need to understand that and have a certain humility and a certain trust in the Holy Spirit, and trust in God's grace and God's presence in our lives to deal with our own failures. Or maybe even too, parents with children, how they develop their children spiritually as well, so that they don't create sort of a sense of, I need to be perfect. And when things aren't perfect, and when we fall into any kind of sin or anything like that, that we really need to be, understanding and helping them to see this as God would see it, and understand his great mercy, right?
And that kind of goes with the, that whole body of literature on forgiveness and emotional well-being. Dr. Enright and some of his research showing how important it is to understand forgiveness, experience forgiveness, to be able to let go of certain things. And we see a huge link to emotional well-being.
Yes, it's almost like sometimes we put the bar higher for ourselves than God does. and not realizing that he made us. He knows exactly who we are. He knows exactly what we're made of. We just need to really make an act of trust. It takes some faith, actually, in a way, to be able to accept ourselves, accept our own shortcomings, right? Yeah.
So, and that's interesting. It was really interesting for us that we could find students who rated a high discrepancy between their perception of where they should be versus where they perceive themselves did score higher on depression inventories. So that was an interesting piece, to see from the data.
And then, I know you mentioned the other perfectionism. What did you say? I see a lot. I don't know. You have your own children, Dr. Closely. I don't have children, obviously, but it seems like today, as opposed to when I was growing up, 30, 40 years ago, sometimes it seems like some families put so much pressure, and also the culture in general, the younger children need to be performing at a high level in second and third grade, because then they won't get into a particular high school, which means then they won't get into a particular college. Do you see that as contributing to this? And then when they get to the college, they feel like, oh my God, I'm here now. I better not fail here, or even just be subpar in any way.
I read a study just a little while ago that discussed kind of almost a burnout syndrome amongst young college students. And I think discussing this push, right? High school, SAT scores, ACT scores, GPA, scholarships, pushing through, take dual credits. So when you get into college, students having this fatigue, kind of coming out of those high school years. So I'm sure there's more literature out there. There's just one study I saw a little while ago, which I could see, there is a lot of pressure on young people.
And in parenting, right? And how to go against the grain, how to go against the currents of the culture today, in sort of make it even harder for kids to grow up feeling like they need to be perfect and get straight A's and everything else their entire life.
Yeah.
Social media has contributed to that, because kids are exposed to so many more people to compare themselves to. When I was growing up, it was my class and my friends in the neighborhood, and that's pretty much who I interacted with. Now you can interact with countless people and get a sense of what they're doing, and everything is with the photos are the best photos and the best descriptions, and Facebook and everything else. And there's so many there's so many more ways for kids to judge themselves compared to other people. Do you see that as a contributing factor?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the whole discrepancy theory, right? That shows that link to emotional struggle, because you're right, I can compare myself to endless, right? All the YouTube channels people have, all the social media pieces. So the ability to compare and perceive myself as falling short, or maybe fostering that thinking of, well, I should be, I could be, ideally I would like to be, looking like this, doing this, having these accomplishments, I think gives more opportunity for perceived discrepancy, which then would be linked to emotional struggle and depression.
Well, Dr. Closely, this is a very, very interesting topic. And again, thank you so much for being with us today. And I would recommend that anybody who has questions, would like to learn more about this, might go to our website, divinemercy.edu, look at the different programs that are available, and consider, maybe being a student here at Divine Mercy University. And
one of the things, Dr. Klaus is the director of our online Masters in Psychology, and you're interested in doing this kind of research. Maybe she could just tell us briefly. We have a project. Each student does what's called a capstone in this area, if they were interested in depression and college students and those kinds of things.
Yeah, so the capstone is a project our students work on throughout the whole program. It's a great opportunity to dig deeper, go deeper in one area. We start out in the beginning of the program thinking of what's a problem that I've observed that I'd love to address that has, there could be couples struggling in my parish. There could be college students depressed. We've had quite a few focus missionaries studying with us. So the capstone, then they will think through the research literature, psychological research literature. They will think through theological, philosophical, integrative literature to understand that phenomenon better. And then in the end, towards the end of the program, we'll develop an intervention. It could be a retreat, it could be a mentoring program that they write a proposal how to address that problem. So I've loved working with our students. I've done a lot of advising on capstone projects. Really have enjoyed seeing students develop different interventions, programs that they can take to their parishes or places of work and ministry to address different issues.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah. More information at divinemercy.edu.
Dr. Klausley, thank you so much again for being with us. And we look forward to having you on again and discussing another very, very important topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So nice to be here.